Just a second. So we have that. So now it started. And Martin, I let you go from there.
Okay, so should I start? Okay.
Yes.
Great. Let me share the screen for a second. And yes, so can you see my slides? Excellent.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, so good morning. Thank you, Simon and Sophie, for the invitation. Really happy to be here sharing this space with you. It's exciting, you know, like when I received the invitation, there is a group focused on looking at democratic planning, right? So it really was really exciting for me to the idea to come here and discuss, especially to discuss this is a chapter of a book project that I'm currently working on, the paper I shared, but it nonetheless builds upon and expands upon my 2021 book, Gobernar la Utopía, which is the subtitle is the actual, you know, like theme subject of the book on planning and popular power, sobre la planificación y el poder popular, which was a broader inquiry on historical and contemporary debates on economic planning, especially, you know, like the rise and the demise of planning, especially within, you know, like the political vision and the vocabulary of the left, right? And today we are seeing a resurgence on the idea of planning, and so that book intended to map some of the debates, right? And one of the things that was hugely inspiring for the book was the fact that in the city of Santiago was the place where, you know, like many, you know, like debates over this question took place, right? As you can see there, that is the operations room of the CyberSyn project, which was rebuilt and recently last year for an exhibition and which it was a very, you know, like exciting thing to see, you know, like the operations room there, you know, like assembled. And so, you know, like that's of course, you know, like CyberSyn, it's become, you know, like a very, it's been widely discussed in you know, like in social theory, you know, like in the social media and so on. And but, you know, like what led me to, you know, like move, like try to, you know, like move beyond that project, or, you know, like my current research is asking me, because, you know, like CyberSyn, as you might know, it was just a prototype, right? It only, you know, like it was only put into operation one time during the Popular Unity government and for a very limited period of time. So what I wanted to know is, you know, like what does actual socialist planning look like? So this was the prototype, right? So the question is, there was, you know, like actual economic planning to transition beyond, you know, like a capitalist economy. And the effort of this book, among other things, is to reconstruct that, you know, like that particular kind of development of planning, right? And one of the things that, you know, like also was very interesting for me was the fact that, you know, like planning under democratic conditions is very likely to trigger various forms of reactionary, you know, like tendencies, forces, and processes, right? And actually, the only time that the CyberSyn project was put into operation was during the 1972 truck drivers strike, which, you know, like paralyzed the entire road infrastructure of the country. And it was put to use. Actually, one of the chapters of this book is titled Planning for Conflict, right? So basically the fact that, you know, like democratic planning, like it is distinguished from other forms of planning in so far that it needs to be legitimized within, you know, like wide sectors of the population. It will challenge the interest, the vested interest of powerful economic groups, and will trigger, you know, like a backlash, right? So this led me to, especially the chapter that I shared with you, looks at how you know, like how does, you know, like this kind of planning look like, and what kind of reactionary tendencies and processes it engenders, right? So the chapter, just I want to show you a brief sketch of the book project, right? So it's chapter 3 within, you know, like this broader book. So I want to, you know, like, because you've already read the chapter, I won't, you know, like try to, you know, like summarize or go over the chapter. I think it's more productive to give a broader contextualization of the book project as such. And, you know, like, and especially since, you know, like this is a group on economic planning, on the main characteristics of, you know, like planning. So as part of this book project, I've also published an article, which is, you know, like very much related to this chapter, which was published in the last issue of Radical Philosophy, in case you want to take a look at it, which is premised on, you know, like the actual experience of the popular unity government with development planning, right? And in terms of the book project in general, I was very like it was very fascinating to see how Marxist dependency theory, I mean the dependency theory, but Marxist dependency theory in general, enabled a synthesis between two wide political currents in Latin America. First, you know, like socialism on the one hand, and on the other hand, 19th century republicanism. Which was connected to major, you know, like wars of national independence for abolition of the sort that, for example, transformed Simón Bolívar into a major political figure in Latin American history. So it was really interesting to see how in the theoretical program, the tenets of Marxist dependency theory, you can see a synthesis between socialism and republicanism. And it also dialogues with other efforts of creating such a dialogue between socialism and republicanism, right? So for example, you have Bruno Leipold's forthcoming book, which he's published some other articles on, you know, like that particular synthesis. In Latin America, there's also been an effort to reconstruct how socialism and republicanism have come into, you know, like synthesis and cross-fertilization with each other. And so for that reason, you know, the book is precisely trying to look at how Marxist dependency theory, whose canonical works were written and published in Santiago during the long 1960s, right? So for example, you have this book by Romero Marini, which is you know, like a landmark, a flagship book of the Marxist dependency theory program. And was also very much within the context of the popular unity government and the popular unity coalition as, you know, like a wide-ranging process of mass political organization. And one of the interesting things about the popular unity coalition is that, like many other experiences of revolutionary socialism in Latin America, it also builds upon this republican lineage of that puts it at the forefront the question of national emancipation, national autonomy, national self-determination, right? So so for example, in that poster, it's, you know, like Allende always referred to in his, you know, like speeches, you know, like and the political propaganda of that time, they referred to the idea of a second independence, to signal that if a first independence had been political, you know, like the wars of national independence in the 19th century enabled, you know, Latin American economies to achieve political sovereignty, there was yet a second independence to be achieved, and this second independence was of an inherently economic nature, right? So there was, you know, it needed to safeguard economic sovereignty for Latin American economies against the power of the landholding aristocracy, economic monopoly power, and imperialistic economic interests, right? So it's the book basically shows how that political context of the popular unity informed, and also, you know, like there was important cross-fertilization between, you know, like the efforts of these theoreticians to rethink some of the core categories of Marxian political economy, but within this broader political and social context, right? And it's also interesting how the question of development as such has been also placed within the framework of this idea of freedom as non-domination, right? Because one of the key tenets of a Republican understanding of freedom is that someone is free as long as it is not at the mercy of someone else's will, right? And it's interesting how, for example, this article by José Miguel Ahumada, Bringing Freedom Back to Developmentalism, is also an effort at showing how some of the developmentalist currents in Latin America also had or developed an implicit understanding of freedom as non-domination because they considered the capitalist interstate system to be riven by relations of domination from rich towards poor nation states. And so many of the proponents of Latin American structuralism, dependency theory, consider that for states to be free, they had to not be at the mercy of powerful states and powerful economic interests, right? And in the article by Ahumada, the idea of national liberation, of national emancipation, is tantamount to endogenous industrialization. So again, you have this idea of, like a first political independence and a second economic independence that it entails, like the transformation of an endogenous industrial sector with certain characteristics of, like production and economic configuration. So when you start to look at some of the major figures of Latin American, of the socialist tradition in Latin America, you can see how, like this idea of a first and a second independence is it gravitates around the discussion. So for example, Ernesto Che Guevara in a book that was published in 1972 in Chile, actually by the state-owned press Quimantu under the Popular Unity, he also frames the problem of the second independence, which, as you might have seen in the chapter that was circulated, he makes an argument that U.S. like large multinational corporations operating in Cuba at the moment resembled the forms of tyranny and political domination that were characteristic of the Spanish crown in the period of colonialism, right? So just as like the Spanish crown was able to thwart or to decide upon major aspects of social and economic life in Cuba, so were multinational corporations acquired like such a massive power over Cuba that the only way was for like Cuba to establish a major agrarian reforms, industrial policy to create its own economic autonomy, right? So it's really interesting how there's this like constant knot between like authors in the tradition of dependency developmentalism towards this like historical precedent of national independence in the 19th century. I'll show you how like this synthesis also emerged in the context of the authoritarian turn to symbolize the struggle against fascism and military dictatorships. So it was also quite interesting how this dialogue between socialism and republicanism was also transformed and reconfigured in the struggle against dictatorships. Okay, so basically, like to give you a broad idea of where does this chapter sit within the broader architecture of the book. So basically, like the key tenets of the book project is that Marxist dependency theory embodies a synthesis between idioms of socialism and those of national liberation, right? Which is precisely what I was discussing a while before. Second, this is really relevant. Marxist dependency theory discovered a new modality of international subordination premised not on an equal exchange, which was, like the sort of the common sense understanding of international subordination at the moment, right? Especially structuralist economics, for example, was that, that Latin American economies are engaged in a process of unequal exchange with powerful developed nations, right? So Marxist dependency theory argued that yes, unequal exchange is a piece of the puzzle, but it insufficiently captures the nature of international subordination in a context where it is industrial penetration through investment by large multinational corporations, which is the main driver of international domination, especially in the post-war period. So proponents of Marxist dependency theory argued that large multinational corporations were completely reconfiguring the structure of ownership and control in peripheral economies, and major key sectors of the economy were becoming denationalized as a result, right? So it was a matter of production and of industrial reproduction rather than an equal exchange, which for these authors, Marini, Bambirra, and Dos Santos, Bambirra referred to, for example, dependent reproduction, right, as the core driver of international domination in the post-war period. So this is important to signal that I want to hint at like how the question of industrial policy and industrial transformation played a major role in the question of in the popular unity government, right? Also, another key tenet of the book is that after 1973, Marxist dependency theory also shifts from a core concern on economics to a concern on questions of politics, democracy, and authoritarianism. And it starts to theorize how the authoritarian turn that began with the 1964 coup in Brazil, and that led to like this spectacular form in the 1973 coup in Chile, signaled a new phase of global capitalist domination where political authoritarianism became harnessed as a lever of free market reforms, of structural adjustment programs. So there was a whole, and as you can see here in the table of contents, the final chapter of the book is precisely focused on the question of like fascism and the problem of strategy. So what to do with this new authoritarian turn, right? So, and finally, Marxist dependency theory also presupposes an ethic of praxis, right? So it was also quite interesting how many of these intellectuals were very politically involved. Many of them were very informed by existentialism, especially, for example, the Cuban Revolution had a very profound effect on intellectuals. And this trope, the Guevara trope of the new man, of the El Hombre Nuevo, which was like a figure of commitment, of solidarity, created this big push for intellectuals in Latin America to become politically involved, to declare their commitment with a cause, right? And so many of the intellectuals had, and this created a very specific type of knowledge that was at once that or strive to be scientific as well as committed, right? So that was like an intellectual environment that was driven by questions of also political responsibility, commitment, and so the book also gravitates around how these intellectuals navigated that more ethical question of like commitment and political responsibility, which also, as you might have seen, comes across clearly in the personal and biographical trajectories of some of the officials and intellectuals involved in the popular unity, which went from like universities to like taking important positions as decision makers in the government. Many of them, most of them, were militants in political parties, and so that was the kind of like environment, personal and academic environment of the time, right? Okay, so now going to the chapter as such, one of the things that like the chapters tries to do is to reconceptualize or try to reconstruct the specific understanding of development that like was predominant at the time, right? And one of the reasons for me to try to reconstruct the idea of development is that development is often understood as a shorthand for modernization, for growth, or for social policy, right? So this is very clear, for example, in both liberal and post-structuralist interpretations of development, right? So for example, you have people like in the post-development degrowth perspective saying that degrowth is merely a shorthand for, like it's just a facade for colonialism, right? For a neo-colonial imposition of Western interests. And also you have, like the liberal interpretations of development, basically treating development as a shorthand for economic growth, right? And you have, for example, the Human Development Program, which is, like a very influential paradigm within the UN framework, for example, that considers development in terms of basically social policy, right? So health, like food provision, pensions, those kinds of social policies. However, what I try to show with that book chapter is that for Marxist dependency theory and for cognate approaches, also structuralism, like classical structuralism, development also entailed the transformation of the productive and technological structure of the national economy. And like as one of the most paradigmatic books, which is not from the Marxist, but kind of the more neo-Weberian framework of dependency, which is the Cardoso and Faleto Dependency and Development in Latin America, they define development in terms of the social control of production and consumption in the national economy, right? So development is not growth, it's not modernization, or not just growth, not just modernization, not just social policy, but the question of who controls the economy and in whose benefit, right? I thought that this was a very interesting understanding of development because it presupposes an element of self-government, right? And especially economic self-government. And that is why the title of the book chapter is Development as Economic Self-Government. And this is particularly interesting given that many of these classical development frameworks in Latin America were also very critical of Western theories of modernization that considered, like development to be merely like a linear process of, like stages, like in which, like underdeveloped economies would eventually increasingly start to look like European economies, right? It was very kind of a Eurocentric interpretation of development that these approaches challenged, saying that there is, like the question of stages does not hold, like there is in fact a hierarchical system, and underdeveloped economies became integrated with rules of the game that were already established. So the whole idea of stages was, is untenable, right? So for that reason, these intellectuals rather intended to define development in terms of economic sovereignty, self-government. And so for that reason, planning was, of course, like the logical corollary of the idea of development. So if economies were to achieve development, they had to embark on ambitious programs for social and economic planning. Yes, so if like development entailed a conscious effort to transform the technological and productive structure of the national economy, it, like the logical corollary was like planning. And one thing that also was very, I think, interesting for me, and that it's very powerfully and beautifully embodied, for example, in the industrial design of the Cybersyn operations room, is the fact that the Popular Unity government intended to create a framework of planning that deviated, or like a kind of a third approach, right? That was clearly distinguished from the kind of a bureaucratic top-down centralization of the Soviet model, but also from other important models, socialist models, such as like the Yugoslav model of workers of government. So the popular unity, like drew from some of these approaches, but was also critical of both the Soviet and the Yugoslav model, right? The Soviet model, obviously, for its like bureaucratic and centralized nature, but it was also critical of the Yugoslav model for its lack of of a coherent and general development, or like plan targets at the national level. So it was very like that kind of market socialism, right? It was very like fascinating, and the book also in other chapters reconstructs the discussion on the kind of a market socialism approach implemented by the Yugoslav model, and how the popular unity considered that it was also very problematic because it lacked a kind of a general like horizon or framework towards like where planning, it lacked planning. Basically it couldn't be left exclusively to like the self-government in individual economic units. So in an interview between Allende and Regis Debray, they started to discuss the Yugoslav model I think in 1971. And Allende argued that workers, yes, they had to, like had the certainty that there was, like a workplace democracy, like in their factory, like wherever they worked. But they also need to have a clear vision of what was the national interest and what were the core targets at the national level. So for that reason, they were also, like to some extent critical of the market socialism of the Yugoslav model. So that was a really interesting characteristic. This is an illustration from the popular education booklets by Marta Harnecker and Gabriel Uribe, which were used as an educational device in in programs for political training in Chile and many other countries. This had these booklets had like a major reception in Latin America and beyond. So you can see here how that like understanding of democratic planning as not overly like centralized, not overly like workerist either, right? It's like visually represented in this figure, right? Where you can see a planning board. It's also interesting to see like the gendered aspect of planning. Like the planning board is like males with like suits and ties, right? But nonetheless, like it's interesting to see how like information flows from workplaces, like from mines, from like agricultural production sectors. Yes, and it was also like like the idea that like planning also had to go hand in hand with like political organization, especially in the figure of the party, right? There was a lot of discussion of the role of the party form in ensuring like the democratic capacities that planning required, right? Okay, so basically, what were the main targets of the what was called El Plan Buskovich? It was named after Pedro Buskovich, which was the Minister of Finance of the Popular Unity government, an economist who worked at the CEPAL, but was also very influenced by Marxist dependency theory, as like as you might have seen in the chapter. So basically, the core targets of the Plan Buskovich was first the creation of a social property sector, or área de propiedad social, as it was called, APS, which involved the creation of a set of national, or like it wasn't like strictly nationalized corporations, because again, this was like this was a philosophy that combined aspects of nationalization with aspects of workplace democracy. So it was social property was precisely to signal the fact that this just wasn't a nationalized sector, right? But anyways, it was like these companies that were considered strategic for the development program of the Popular Unity, and which included companies in retail, mining, agricultural production, exports, and so on. Second, a second target of the Buskovich plan, or Plan Buskovich, was a robust program for income redistribution that could democratize access to basic consumer goods. This is systematically developed in the excellent book by Joshua Friendstring, Hungry for Revolution, that shows how many of the policies entailed, like raising wages in different forms, creating schemes for cooperative ownership of some companies so that workers could benefit from the company's profits, and could like enlarge like their and could like have access to consumer goods. And just to think that during that specific historical period, there were many short deficiencies like in nutrition, like there was lack of access to like many like the basic consumer goods. Third, there was the creation of a state-owned banking sector and foreign trade company, basically on the grounds that a capitalist banking system will not allocate credit to activities that are like unprofitable yet strategic for development in the long term. So basically, on the basis, it was the idea of creating a development banks that could allocate money and credit to companies that would enable the implementation of the industrial policy. And fourth, which is a very relevant element, the implementation of an agrarian reform that could redistribute land and boost agricultural production. So that's where Jackson Chol, the Minister of Agriculture, comes in, like as the expert as in the agrarian expert and policy expert that designed this agrarian reform. As you can see here in this image was included in the article published in Radical Philosophy, which shows some of these key like targets of the government program. And as you can see, of course, like again, going back to this idea of socialism and national independence, it was underpinned by a very anti-imperialist orientation, right? And again, to reaffirm, like Allende was kind of very connected to this, like 19th century lineage of national liberation and national autonomy approaches, right? So it's really interesting how even visually how like that synthesis between socialism and national liberation was powerfully accomplished by the Popular Unity. Also, an aspect that's also really fascinating, I think, for me is like how the industrial policy of the Popular Unity was intended on shifting from an approach that was aimed at producing, like capital intensive capital goods towards, like the creation of accessible, affordable consumer goods for the population. So in this exhibition, which it was a really brilliant and beautiful exhibition, shows the kind of forms of industrial design that emerged from the industrial policy designed by Pedro Buskovich, and which was intended to create these kinds of like everyday objects, beautiful objects for like use in like households for workers. And it was also a very interesting in terms of the economic. I won't go into the details because that was like more systematically developed in the chapter. But the idea behind this was that by shifting towards these kinds of like basic consumer goods, the industrial policy would shift resources towards like from large companies towards medium-sized and small companies that could produce these kinds of goods and would create employment for the urban poor and in manufacturing, right? So there was also a question of how to create employment with this kind of redesign of the industrial apparatus, right? And also, like the agrarian reform was also hugely interesting because Jacques Chonchol was very inspired by efforts of the Cuban Revolution specifically to create also a third, like path beyond, like that kind of rigid forms of, like Soviet collectivization, and also critical of, like the inefficiency of the minifundia, right? Small, like peasant, like smallholder agriculture. So Chonchol sought to, like create a kind of a synthesis between some for some large units of socialized labor on the one hand, and cooperative and smaller forms of agricultural production on the other, right? So that was, like a really interesting facet of the agrarian reform implemented, which again, I won't go into that in detail because it's in the article, in the chapter, and also in the radical philosophy article. And yes, and now coming to, like the kind of a tragic part of the and this is quite interesting. I mean, especially if the group is, like focused on democratic planning. This is an inevitable, inescapable aspect of what actually existing democratic planning can and will eventually look like, right? So once implemented, because of course these reforms challenge the vested interests not only of, like domestic oligarchic groups, but also, like large multinational corporations, especially from the United States. They created these forms of, like both Allende and Pedro Buscovich referred to these forms of, like sabotage as economic sabotage. And I termed this, like in the chapter, sabotage of development, because it was, like trying to thwart precisely that aspect of democratic self-government that the idea of development entailed, right? So there were many tactics of economic sabotage, like put into work against the popular unity government. One of them was a parliamentary blockade that thwarted efforts at progressive tax reform. So that would a progressive tax reform would have given the government a leeway to implement like a social policy and to get the resources to finance programs of productive reconfiguration, right? Second, there was a more international strategy of withdrawal of foreign lending and foreign aid by the US and multilateral organizations. So this was also fundamental because the US, the figures, I mean, you might have seen the figures, Chile received, like many considerable amounts of money in terms of foreign loans, and these loans plummeted during the first and second year of when the government was in office. And again, this was connected to a broader, like geopolitical effort of, like as like President Richard Nixon argued, like there was this famous order to make the Chilean economy scream, right? So this was, like the withdrawal of credit and aid was one of the like symptoms or, like tactics to create like economic difficulties for the government. Third, there was also a commercial blockade by major producers of technical inputs for production. So for example, producers of agricultural machinery, mining machinery, producers of, like spare parts for, like tractors or, like mining trucks did not like sell their products to the Chilean economy, also creating major like disruptions in production. And finally, at the domestic level, there was also problematic instances of food hoarding and speculation to create panic in the population. So this is also, like very systematically developed in Joshua Frenstring's book, Hungry for Revolution. It's a very detailed and systematic account of how those practices of economic sabotage played out. So of course, like there was, like an effort, like by the organized left, the political left, to try to, like circumvent or, like denounce those practices of sabotage, but they were ultimately inevitable. And in 1970, by the end of 1972, both Chonchol and Buskovich, the ministers of finance and the minister of agriculture, the officials who designed the development program, were forced to resign. Okay, and so after the coup, like there were, like many efforts at, like trying to reflect on what have happened. Like the article, the chapter also shows, like how this like reactionary or authoritarian turn was conceptualized as a Bonapartization of political power. Teotonio dos Santos, writing from exile, also referred to it as dependent fascism, as like that kind of alliance between some of the most backward elements of like oligarchies, landholding aristocracy, and multinational corporations that like were coming together to create a new modality of political authoritarianism in the region. So I won't go into the details because that's part of the final chapter of the book on dependent fascism. But there was a lot of debate about, like precisely the relationship between capitalist development or modernization and authoritarianism. So you have this also groundbreaking book by Guillermo O'Donnell, Modernización y Autoritarismo, which also focused on the question of planning, like in quite tragic terms. So the argument was that the same technical cadres, like the same technical bodies and technocrats that were like produced by programs of development planning and import substitution programs in Latin America were, like kind of extrapolated or, like instrumentalized to manage the repressive apparatus of authoritarian regimes. So that's, like a kind of a mind-blowing argument about how the instruments created for, like popular democratic planning can, like become like hacked and reconfigured, transformed for reactionary governance, right? So it's, like a very tragic, but also I think it's an inevitable and a very relevant aspect if, like democratic planning is to incorporate any mechanisms to, like anticipate or how to, like manage. And again, like one chapter of this book precisely grapples with that question in perhaps more conceptual terms. But I think that the experience of economic sabotage that was suffered by the popular unity is, I think, very illustrative of the stakes involved in democratic planning. I mean, if it is going to be really transformative and not just, like kind of tinkering over the edges, democratic planning will face very dramatic forms of economic sabotage. So, okay, so I think I'll leave it here. So just to give more room to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Just before we enter the conversation, I saw in your in your chapter, Martin, that you made an interview also with one of those two minister of the Allende government that was published in Jacobin, the Latin American version. Could you just introduce us to how you met him, what he had to say, maybe a few words about this interview?
Oh yes, it was I actually, let me show you because Jacobin did some really beautiful, stunning illustrations of the interview. Let me show you. So it was published, the title was Recipes for the Agriculture of the Future. And so they did this, like beautiful graphic design, which, like show this, like kind of, so this is the Chilean flag with some like fields, agricultural fields. This is, like a peasant, like working in a field with, like a fork. And again, yeah. So yeah, it was, like a really, really fascinating experience to get to meet a legendary, I mean, he's clearly a legend, not only in Chile, but throughout Latin America. And he was 93 years old when I interviewed him. And it was quite impressive that he was very lucid and he would remembered really well what happened. He spoke, like about in detail about, like the figures. I met him via the via his family. Someone introduced me to his son, Diego, and he was very generous, and he organized the interview for me. So it was, we spoke for like 3 hours, you know, like very generous, you know, like, and he spoke about many of the aspects of and this is a very interesting anecdote. I asked him about the CyberSyn project, and I was baffled to hear that he didn't know about it. So one would have imagined that he might have been involved in some way, and you know, like, but he didn't know about the project. So it was a very boutique project, apparently, because I mean, or I don't know, but it was a really interesting discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Martin. We'll switch to question and answers now, and I'll stop the recording. And